Jung's most dangerous discovery about spiritual awakening wasn't that people fail to achieve it. It was that most people who succeed become psychologically worse than before they started. In 1928, a man came to Jung celebrating his spiritual breakthrough. 3 years of intensive inner work, meditation, shadow integration, dream analysis. He'd experienced what he called his awakening, a profound shift in consciousness that made him feel more aware, more conscious, more evolved than everyone around him. Jung saw immediately what the man couldn't. He hadn't awakened. He'd inflated. The man had done real psychological work. He'd accessed genuine archetypal material. He'd touched something powerful in his unconscious. But instead of integrating this experience with humility, he'd identified with it. He believed he had become the power he'd contacted. Jung wrote in his notes, "He came to me glowing with spiritual pride, certain he'd achieved enlightenment. In reality, he'd merely traded one form of unconsciousness for another. Before, he was identified with his persona, the mask he showed the world. Now he was identified with the self. The archetypal power flowing through him, both are equally unconscious. But the latter is far more dangerous because it masquerades as consciousness. Within 6 months, this man had destroyed every significant relationship in his life. Not through obvious cruelty, but through something more insidious, spiritual superiority. He would listen to people's problems and think, they're still so unconscious. He would observe normal human behavior, people complaining, gossiping, struggling, and feel a mix of pity and contempt. He stopped spending time with old friends because their energy was too low. He became unable to tolerate anyone who didn't share his level of awakening. He believed he was becoming more enlightened. In reality, he was becoming a narcissist with spiritual vocabulary. Jung documented this pattern in dozens of patients over 3 decades, people who did genuine inner work, who touched real transpersonal experiences, would return not more humble, but more arrogant, not more connected, but more isolated, not more compassionate, but more judgmental. They would use spiritual language to describe what was actually psychological inflation. I've raised my vibration meant I feel superior. I'm more conscious meant I judge everyone else as asleep. I see through the illusion meant I'm special and others are not. Jung called this phenomenon psychic inflation, the most common consequence of spiritual awakening that no one in spiritual communities wants to acknowledge. Because spiritual awakening doesn't make most people enlightened, it makes them inflated. And inflated people are functionally indistinguishable from narcissists, except they have better justifications for their behavior. Today, I'm going to show you the 7 signs Jung identified that mark the transition from genuine awakening to psychic inflation. Not the pleasant spiritual markers you see in awakening content, the actual psychological phenomena that indicate you've become inflated rather than integrated. These aren't abstract concepts. They're concrete behaviors Jung observed in patient after patient who believed they were awakening when they were actually inflating. Because Jung discovered that there's a razor-thin line between touching transpersonal power and being consumed by it, between genuine awakening and spiritual narcissism, between integration and inflation. And most people who cross that line never come back. They spend the rest of their lives certain they're enlightened, while everyone around them experiences them as insufferable. The difference comes down to one thing: whether you can touch archetypal power without believing you are that power. And these 7 signs reveal which side of that line you're on. Jung's understanding of psychic inflation came from a painful personal experience that nearly destroyed him. Between 1913 and 1917, Jung underwent what he called his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of intense psychological crisis where he deliberately explored his own unconscious material through active imagination, dream work, and what he later termed descent into the depths. He encountered powerful archetypal figures, spoke with inner guides, experienced visions that felt more real than waking life, accessed material that seemed to come from beyond his personal psyche, from what he'd later call the collective unconscious. And for a period of time, Jung became inflated. He writes about this period with brutal honesty in his private journals, later published as The Red Book. There were moments when he believed he was a prophet, times when he felt chosen by transpersonal forces to deliver a message to humanity, periods when he experienced himself as special, elevated, carrying knowledge others couldn't understand. He was on the edge of psychosis, but more dangerously, he was on the edge of identifying himself with the archetypal material he was encountering. Jung's salvation came through a realization he'd spend the rest of his career refining: the difference between experiencing archetypal power and believing you are that power. He wrote, "I had accessed real transpersonal material. The visions were genuine. The experiences were valid. But the moment I believed I was the source of this material, rather than merely the vessel through which it flowed, I became inflated. I had confused the ego with the self. This is the fundamental error of psychic inflation." After this experience, Jung became hypervigilant about inflation in his patients, and he found it everywhere, especially among those doing genuine spiritual work. The pattern was consistent. A person would begin authentic inner work: therapy, meditation, shadow integration, active imagination. They would touch something real, genuine unconscious material, archetypal experiences, transpersonal states. Then, instead of integrating this experience with humility, they would inflate. They would identify with the power they'd contacted. They would believe they had become enlightened, awakened, evolved beyond normal human consciousness, and their behavior would shift in predictable ways. They would become subtly superior. They would lose the capacity for genuine connection with unawakened people. They would develop spiritual justifications for all their behaviors. They would surround themselves only with people who validated their inflated self-image. Jung observed, "The inflated person is convinced they are beyond ego. In reality, they have merely created a spiritual ego far more defended than the ordinary ego they transcended. This spiritual ego is invisible to them because it wears the costume of enlightenment." The man who came to Jung in 1928 exemplified this perfectly. He'd done real work. The breakthrough he experienced was genuine. He had touched archetypal material, but he made a fatal error. He believed he had permanently transcended his ego rather than temporarily touched something beyond it. He started speaking about himself in ways that signaled inflation. "I've moved beyond the need for normal relationships. Most people are still living in illusion. I see reality as it truly is now. I'm operating from a higher level of consciousness." All of these statements revealed the same thing: identification with the self rather than relationship with the self. Jung worked with him for 2 years, trying to help him see the inflation, but the man couldn't. Every challenge Jung offered, he interpreted as Jung not understanding his level of consciousness. He eventually left therapy convinced Jung was stuck in traditional psychological thinking and couldn't comprehend awakened states. Jung wrote in his notes, "He is lost. He has touched genuine transpersonal material, but identified with it completely. He will spend the rest of his life certain he is enlightened, while everyone who knew him before watches him become progressively more isolated, more arrogant, more insufferable. He has become precisely what he sought to transcend: unconscious. But now his unconsciousness wears the mask of consciousness, making it impossible to reach." Jung tracked what happened to this man over the following decade. He didn't reconnect with family he'd alienated. He cycled through spiritual communities, always finding them not conscious enough. He developed a small following of people who validated his inflation. He wrote a book about his awakening that was essentially spiritual narcissism disguised as wisdom. He never recovered from his inflation because he never recognized it as inflation. This became Jung's most important warning about spiritual awakening. Genuine transpersonal experience is possible and valuable, but it comes with an extraordinary danger. The moment you believe you have become the power you've touched, you've inflated. And inflation masquerades as enlightenment so perfectly that the inflated person cannot distinguish between the two. Jung spent the rest of his career developing tests to distinguish genuine integration from psychic inflation. He identified 7 specific signs that mark inflation rather than awakening. And he was clear: most people who pursue spiritual awakening will display these signs. Because psychic inflation is not the rare exception on the spiritual path, it's the default outcome. The first sign of inflation is subtle but unmistakable once you see it. The person uses spiritual language to express what is actually psychological superiority. Jung observed that inflated individuals develop a whole vocabulary for describing their specialness while maintaining plausible deniability that they're being superior. Listen to how they speak. I've raised my vibration. I'm better than people at lower vibrations. I'm more conscious now. Others are unconscious, asleep. I see through the matrix, illusion. I have access to truth. Others don't. They're still in ego. I've transcended ego, even though I clearly haven't. I only connect with high vibe people, equals I judge most people as beneath me. I'm operating from my higher self, equals my perspective is more valid than yours. Each of these phrases allows the person to feel and express superiority while using spiritual frameworks that make the superiority seem like objective observation rather than judgment. The integrated person might have the exact same experiences but describes them differently. I'm working with my shadow, not I've transcended my shadow. I caught myself in an ego pattern, not I'm beyond ego now. I experience something I can't fully explain, not I've awakened to ultimate truth. I'm learning to see my projections, not I see reality clearly now while others are in illusion. The distinction is critical. The inflated person speaks as though they've arrived. The integrated person speaks as though they're in ongoing process. Jung wrote, "The inflated individual cannot tolerate uncertainty or not knowing. They must convert every experience into proof of their evolution. Meanwhile, the truly integrated person becomes more comfortable with mystery, more humble about their understanding, more aware of how much they still don't know." If you find yourself regularly using spiritual vocabulary to explain why you're different from, more advanced than, or can't relate to normal people anymore, this is the first sign of inflation, not awakening. The second sign appears as an increasing inability to tolerate normal human messiness. Before inflation, you could sit with friends as they complained about work, gossiped about mutual acquaintances, worried about trivial problems, processed their emotions through venting. You participated in ordinary human social interaction. After inflation, this becomes unbearable. Not because you've transcended these behaviors through genuine integration, but because you've identified with an idealized image of yourself as beyond these patterns. You find yourself thinking, they're so unconscious. Why are they still complaining about this? Don't they see they're creating their own suffering? I can't be around this low vibe energy anymore. They need to take responsibility for their reality. You've lost the capacity for compassion toward ordinary human struggle because you're identified with being awakened and they're still asleep. Jung observed this in patient after patient. They would report losing the ability to spend time with old friends, family members, anyone who wasn't on the path, One woman told Jung, "I just can't relate to people who are still so unconscious. My sister wants to talk about her job stress, her relationship problems. I'm beyond that level of consciousness now. I've evolved past needing to process those kinds of issues." Jung's response was direct. "You haven't evolved past these issues. You've dissociated from your own humanity. Your sister is living in reality, the messy, complicated, ordinary reality of being human. You're living in spiritual fantasy where you've placed yourself above the human condition. This isn't enlightenment. This is inflation masquerading as transcendence. The truly integrated person can hold space for ordinary human messiness because they haven't disowned their own humanity. They've integrated their shadow, which means they know they're still capable of all the same patterns they see in others. They can listen to someone complain without judgment because they remember their own complaints. They can witness someone's unconscious behavior without superiority because they're aware of their own unconscious patterns. Inflation creates intolerance. Integration creates compassion. If you've lost the ability to be with people in their ordinary human messiness without judging them as unconscious, this is inflation, not evolution. The third sign is particularly insidious because it sounds so spiritually mature. The inflated person replaces the word judgment with discernment. They'll say things like, "I'm not judging them. I'm just discerning that our energies don't align." It's not judgment, it's discernment. I can feel their frequency isn't compatible with mine. I'm discerning what's right for my journey by avoiding low-vibe people. It's not superiority, it's discernment about who I allow in my energy field. Every single one of these statements is judgment disguised as spiritual wisdom. Jung was blunt about this. The inflated person cannot admit they judge others because judgment contradicts their self-image as awakened. So they rebrand judgment as discernment. But energetic incompatibility is often just spiritual language for, "I feel superior to you and don't want to be challenged by your presence." Real discernment is recognizing genuine incompatibility, like identifying a narcissistic relationship pattern you need to exit. That's protective discernment based on behavior. Inflated discernment is feeling superior to someone because you perceive their frequency as lower than yours. That's judgment wearing spiritual clothing. The distinction. Real discernment protects you from harm. Inflated discernment protects your ego from anything that challenges your inflated self-image. One of Jung's patients used discernment to cut off her entire family because they're not conscious enough to understand my path. Jung asked her to list specific harmful behaviors her family had done to warrant this complete disconnection. She couldn't. They were just too low vibe. Jung told her, "Your family didn't harm you. They failed to validate your inflated self-image. So you've used spiritual language to justify abandoning them. This isn't discernment. This is using awakening as permission to avoid anyone who reflects your humanity back to you. If you're using discernment to explain why you can't be around most people, and the reason is their energy or frequency, rather than specific harmful behaviors, this is inflation, not wisdom." The fourth sign manifests as using spiritual concepts to avoid relational accountability. The inflated person will damage relationships and then use spiritual frameworks to avoid responsibility. Our souls contracted for this lesson. Everything happens for a reason. This was meant to teach them something. I'm honoring my truth even if it hurts others. I can't dim my light just because it triggers their shadows. People who can't handle my authenticity aren't my people. Each of these phrases allows the person to hurt others while maintaining their self-image as spiritually evolved. Jung documented this pattern extensively. Patients would end marriages, abandon children, betray friends, all while using spiritual language to frame their behavior as following their path or honoring their truth. One man left his wife and children for a younger woman he met at a retreat. He told Jung, "My soul was calling me to this connection. My marriage was a karmic contract that had completed. I had to honor my higher self by following this calling." Jung's response: "Your higher self is not calling you to abandon your children. Your ego is using spiritual language to justify behavior you know is harmful. If you need to leave your marriage, do so honestly. Take responsibility for causing pain, for breaking commitments, for damaging your children. Don't hide behind spiritual justifications that allow you to feel evolved while behaving unconsciously. The integrated person takes full responsibility for their impact on others, even when making difficult choices. They don't use spiritual concepts to bypass relational accountability. They might say, 'I need to end this relationship, and I know this will cause pain. I take full responsibility for that pain, even though I believe this choice is necessary for my growth.' The inflated person says, 'The universe is guiding me to leave. Anyone truly conscious would understand this is my path.' One erases their accountability, the other maintains it. If you're using spiritual concepts to justify behaviors that harm others while avoiding responsibility for that harm, this is inflation, not enlightenment. The fifth sign appears as a complete imperviousness to feedback, rationalized through spiritual concepts. Anyone who challenges the inflated person's behavior is immediately framed as projecting their shadows onto me, triggered by my light, not conscious enough to understand, attacking me because I reflect what they haven't integrated, unable to handle my frequency. This creates an impenetrable defense. Every piece of feedback, every expression of hurt, every attempt to hold them accountable gets reinterpreted as the other person's problem. Jung called this the closed circuit of inflation. Once someone is inflated, no external feedback can penetrate because it's all reframed as proof of other people's unconsciousness. One woman had 5 different friends tell her separately that she'd become arrogant and difficult to be around since her awakening. Her response each time: "They're threatened by my growth. My evolution triggers their shadows. They're not ready to face what I reflect back to them." Jung asked her, 5 different people who love you are telling you the same thing. Is it possible they're seeing something real? Or are all 5 of them wrong and you're the only one seeing clearly? She couldn't even consider it. "I can't shrink myself to make them comfortable with my awakening." Jung wrote in his notes, "She has created an epistemic closed loop. Her inflation is now self-confirming. Every challenge to it becomes proof of others' unconsciousness. She is trapped in her own inflation with no exit." The integrated person can receive difficult feedback without immediately framing it as projection. They sit with it, consider whether it might be true, ask themselves, could they be seeing something I'm missing? They know that genuine growth requires ongoing feedback from people who love them enough to challenge them. The inflated person cannot tolerate any feedback that contradicts their self-image as awakened. So all feedback becomes projection, triggering, or unconscious attack. If no one can tell you anything that challenges your spiritual self-image without you immediately reframing it as their projection, this is inflation, not consciousness. The 6th sign manifests as a compulsion to teach, share, guide others through awakening before you've actually integrated the material yourself. The inflated person has a breakthrough experience and immediately needs to tell everyone about it. They start a spiritual Instagram. They offer to guide others. They write about their awakening. They position themselves as teachers, not because they've integrated the experience, but because inflation drives them to prove their specialness by adopting the role of spiritual guide, Jung was particularly critical of this pattern. The inflated person cannot simply have an experience and sit with it. They must immediately convert it into proof of their spiritual authority. They haven't done the slow, unglamorous work of integration. They've had an experience and confused it with transformation. Integration takes years, inflation takes days. The person who touches transpersonal material and sits with it quietly, working to integrate it into their daily life without broadcasting it, that's maturity. The person who touches transpersonal material and immediately needs to teach it, share it, build an identity around it, that's inflation, Jung observed. The truly awakened person has nothing to prove. They've seen through the need for spiritual identity altogether. Meanwhile, the inflated person is desperately constructing a spiritual identity to replace the ego identity they believe they've transcended. One of Jung's patients had a profound experience during active imagination. Instead of sitting with it, integrating it, letting it reshape him slowly over time, he quit his job within a week to become a spiritual guide. Jung told him, "You've had one experience. You haven't integrated it. You haven't tested it against the complications of daily life. You haven't discovered what it actually means beyond the initial breakthrough, and yet you're ready to teach others? This isn't service. This is inflation seeking validation." The integrated person might share their experience eventually, after years of integration, but there's no urgency, no need to be seen as a teacher, no compulsion to prove their awakening by adopting spiritual authority. If you've had a spiritual experience and your immediate impulse is to teach others, position yourself as a guide, or build a spiritual identity around it, this is inflation, not integration. The seventh and final sign is the most telling. The inflated person loses the capacity to laugh at themselves. Before inflation, you could acknowledge your own ridiculousness, your contradictions, your ongoing humanity. You had a sense of humor about your flaws. After inflation, you become deadly serious about your spiritual identity. You can't joke about your awakening or acknowledge the absurdity of your spiritual claims because your entire self-worth is now tied to being evolved. Jung wrote, "The moment someone cannot laugh at their own spiritual pretensions, I know they're inflated. Genuine integration maintains a sense of humor about the whole enterprise. The person knows they're still human, still ridiculous, still capable of the same nonsense as everyone else." One patient told Jung very seriously, "I've moved beyond the need for humor. Humor is an ego defense. I'm operating from a more conscious place now." Jung laughed and said, "You just proved my point. You've become so inflated you can't even see how funny it is to claim you're beyond humor. The truly conscious person knows that taking yourself that seriously is the height of unconsciousness. The integrated person can hold profound experiences and still laugh at themselves. They can honor their growth while acknowledging they're still a mess in many ways. They maintain perspective. The inflated person cannot tolerate anything that punctures their spiritual self-image, including humor. If you've lost the ability to laugh at yourself, your spiritual claims, your awakening, this is the final sign. You're inflated, not enlightened. Jung believed psychic inflation was more dangerous than remaining unconscious because inflation masquerades as consciousness so effectively. The unconscious person knows they're struggling. They know they have work to do. They're open to feedback, therapy, growth. The inflated person believes they've already arrived. They're closed to feedback because they interpret it as projection. They're certain they're conscious, which makes them perfectly unconscious without knowing it. Jung called this the second naivete, a return to unconsciousness at a higher level, defended by spiritual concepts rather than simple denial, and it's extraordinarily difficult to treat. Jung wrote, "I can work with someone who knows they're unconscious. I cannot work with someone who believes they're enlightened. The latter will interpret every challenge as my failure to understand their elevated state. They're trapped in an epistemic closed loop with no exit." The man from 1928 never recovered because he couldn't see his inflation. Every relationship that ended, he blamed on others' inability to match his frequency. Every person who challenged him was threatened by his light. Every loss proved his specialness, that he was too evolved for conventional life. He died alone, certain he was enlightened, having never integrated the very material that initiated his inflation. Jung tracked dozens of similar cases. People who touched genuine transpersonal experiences but inflated around them, spending the rest of their lives certain they were awakened while progressively becoming more isolated, more arrogant, more psychologically rigid. The tragedy wasn't that they had the experiences. The experiences were real. The tragedy was that they identified with the experiences rather than integrating them. Jung made a critical distinction. Touching transpersonal material doesn't make you transpersonal. You're still human, still flawed, still ego-driven in countless ways. The integrated person knows this. They've touched something beyond ego, but they haven't confused themselves with it. The inflated person conflates the experience with permanent transformation. They believe they've become what they momentarily touched, and this creates a psychological structure that's almost impossible to penetrate. Because the inflated person has surrounded their ego with spiritual defenses, every challenge becomes projection, every feedback becomes triggering, every loss becomes proof of their specialness. They've created a fortress of inflation that protects them from ever having to see what they've become. Jung observed, "The inflated person is more defended than someone who's never done inner work. They've taken genuine psychological and spiritual concepts, projection, shadow, frequency, consciousness, and weaponized them into a defense against self-awareness." This is why Jung considered inflation the primary danger of the spiritual path. Not that people will fail to have experiences, but that they'll have experiences and inflate around them, becoming worse than they were before they started, now armed with spiritual language to justify their unconsciousness. Jung developed a simple test to distinguish inflation from integration. He called it the humility diagnostic. Ask yourself these 7 questions honestly. Question 1. Can I acknowledge I'm still capable of the same unconscious patterns I judge in others? If you're integrated, you can say, "Yes, I see how I still do this in subtle ways." If you're inflated, you believe, "No, I've transcended those patterns." Question 2. Can I receive critical feedback without immediately framing it as the other person's projection? If you're integrated, your response is, "I can sit with it and consider whether it's true." If you're inflated, you think, "If it challenges my spiritual self-image, it must be their projection." Question 3. Do I need to broadcast my spiritual experiences to feel valid? If you're integrated, you know, "No, the experience is enough." If you're inflated, you feel, "Yes, I need others to acknowledge my awakening." Question 4. Can I spend time with, quote, unconscious people without judgment? If you're integrated, you understand. "Yes, I know I'm also unconscious in countless ways." If you're inflated, you believe, "No, their energy is too low. They're too unconscious." Question 5. Do I use spiritual language to explain why I'm different from others? If you're integrated, you think, "I notice patterns in myself, not my specialness." If you're inflated, you regularly reference my vibration, my consciousness level, or my frequency. Question 6. Can I laugh at myself and my spiritual claims? If you're integrated, you recognize, yes, it's all somewhat ridiculous. If you're inflated, you feel, no, this is serious, I've awakened. Question 7. Have your closest relationships improved or deteriorated since your quote awakening? If you're integrated, they've improved. You're more present, more humble, more connected. If you're inflated, they've deteriorated. You tell yourself, they can't handle my frequency, they can't handle my growth. Jung wrote, if you answered with even one inflated response, you're inflated. If you can't see your inflation in these questions, you're deeply inflated. Only the integrated person can look at this list and say honestly, I recognize inflation in myself. I'm working with it. The test isn't whether you've had awakening experiences. The test is whether you can hold those experiences without identifying with them, without needing them to make you special, without using them to place yourself above others. Jung's final criteria was the most cutting. The truly awakened person wouldn't call themselves awakened. They're too aware of how much unconsciousness remains. Only the inflated person claims awakening. Jung wrote, if you answered with even one inflated response, you're inflated. If you can't see your inflation in these questions, you're deeply inflated. Only the integrated person can look at this list and say honestly, I recognize inflation in myself. I'm working with it. The test isn't whether you've had awakening experiences. The test is whether you can hold those experiences without identifying with them, without needing them to make you special, without using them to place yourself above others. Jung's final criteria was the most cutting. The truly awakened person wouldn't call themselves awakened. They're too aware of how much unconsciousness remains. Only the inflated person claims awakening. Jung rarely saw patients recover from severe inflation, but for those who did, the process always involved the same brutal steps. Step 1. Someone they couldn't dismiss told them the truth. Usually a partner, therapist, or mentor they couldn't immediately frame as unconscious. Someone who said directly, you've become inflated, you're not enlightened, you're arrogant. Step 2. A consequence. They couldn't spiritualize. The loss of something they couldn't rationalize away, with spiritual language, a partner leaving, children refusing contact, complete social isolation, something that forced them to question whether everyone else was wrong or whether they'd become insufferable. Step 3. Brutal admission. The hardest step, admitting, I became inflated. I thought I was awakened, but I was just inflated. I've been insufferable. Jung required patients to write this admission daily for 30 days. No spiritual language. No, it was part of my journey. Just raw admission of inflation. Step 4. Reintegration of humanity. Deliberately spending time with ordinary people without judgment. Noticing every time the thought, they're so unconscious, arose and challenging it with, I'm unconscious too. Learning to be human again. Messy, flawed, uncertain, still growing. Step 5. Ongoing vigilance. Jung was clear. Inflation is always waiting. Every genuine experience carries the risk of identification with it. The recovered person must maintain constant awareness. I'm not the power I've touched. I'm the vessel. I'm still human, still capable of inflation, still need feedback. Jung wrote, recovery from inflation requires more humility than most people can bear. It means admitting you were wrong about your entire self-concept, that you've been insufferable, that you hurt people while believing you were enlightened. Most people cannot bear this level of humiliation. They'd rather stay inflated forever. One woman who recovered told Jung, the hardest part wasn't admitting I was wrong. It was facing everyone I'd hurt while I was inflated. I'd abandoned friends, judged my family, ended my marriage, all while believing I was following my highest path. I had to go back to each person and say, I was inflated, I was wrong. I'm sorry. Most of them couldn't forgive me. I don't blame them. Jung noted. She recovered because she could bear the consequences of her inflation. She didn't spiritualize her losses. She took full responsibility. This is extraordinarily rare. The path back from inflation requires destroying the spiritual identity you've built, admitting you're not special, accepting you're just human, still flawed, still unconscious in countless ways. Most people who inflate never take this path because the cost, complete ego death without the consolation of spiritual specialness, is more than they can pay. If you recognize even one of these 7 signs in yourself, you're at risk of inflation or already inflated. This is not a comfortable realization. Your first response will be to rationalize, this doesn't apply to me. I've actually awakened. This is about other people who fake it. That response itself is a sign of inflation. The integrated person reads this and thinks, I see inflation in myself. I'm capable of this. I need to watch for these patterns. The inflated person reads this and thinks, this is about unconscious people who claim to be awakened. I'm actually awakened, so this doesn't apply to me. See the difference? Jung was clear. Genuine awakening produces humility, not certainty, ongoing self-questioning, not arrival, deepening awareness of your own unconsciousness, not conviction, you've transcended it. If you're certain you're awakened, you're almost certainly inflated. If you're uncertain whether you're awakened or inflated, you might be integrating. If you know you're still mostly unconscious, despite genuine experiences, you're probably on the right path. The question Jung always asked, can you hold powerful spiritual experiences without needing them to make you special? Can you touch transpersonal material without believing you've become transpersonal? Can you see through illusion without believing you're the only one who sees clearly? Can you grow without needing to feel superior to who you were before or to others who haven't had your experiences? Most people cannot. Most people who have genuine spiritual breakthroughs inflate around them. They trade one form of unconsciousness, ordinary ego, for another, spiritual ego. And the second is more dangerous because it's invisible to the person experiencing it. You're not reading this by accident. If these 7 signs resonated, you're either inflated or in danger of inflation. The question is, can you admit it? Because admission is the only way back. And most people would rather stay inflated, certain they're enlightened, isolated from everyone who sees through them, surrounded only by people who validate their inflation. Jung spent his career warning about this. Spiritual awakening is real. Transpersonal experiences are valid, but they come with a danger no one wants to acknowledge. Most people who awaken become narcissists with better vocabulary. Jung wrote about the man from 1928 one final time, 20 years after their last session. I heard he died alone, still certain he was enlightened. His children hadn't spoken to him in years. His ex-wife told me he'd spent the final decades of his life cycling through spiritual communities, always leaving when people couldn't tolerate his arrogance. He wrote 3 books about his awakening. They sold poorly. Not because the experiences weren't genuine, they were, but because the entire enterprise was saturated with inflation. Every page screamed, I am special. I have accessed truth you cannot comprehend. Readers sensed this and rightly rejected it. Jung continued. The tragedy is that his initial breakthrough was real. He had touched genuine transpersonal material, but he made the fatal error of identifying with it. He believed he had become what he'd momentarily experienced, and this identification, this inflation, trapped him in a prison of spiritual narcissism for the rest of his life. This is Jung's warning about spiritual awakening that no spiritual community wants to hear. Genuine experiences don't prevent inflation. They create the conditions for it. The more powerful the experience, the greater the danger of identifying with it. And most people who touch transpersonal material inflate. They spend the rest of their lives certain they're enlightened, while everyone around them experiences them as insufferable. These 7 signs aren't abstract theories. They're the concrete behaviors Jung observed in patient after patient who believed they were awakening when they were inflating. Spiritual vocabulary for superiority, intolerance of ordinary humanness, discernment that's actually judgment, spiritual bypassing of relational accountability, imperviousness to feedback, teaching before integrating loss of humor about yourself. If you recognize these patterns, you're facing a choice. You can dismiss this as not applying to you, which itself is a sign of inflation. Or you can do the brutal work of admitting, I've become inflated, I'm not enlightened. I'm arrogant with spiritual vocabulary. Most people choose the first option. They protect their inflation with more spiritual justifications. They stay trapped in the closed loop where every challenge to their awakening proves other people's unconsciousness. Jung never judged this. He understood. Admitting inflation requires destroying your entire spiritual self-concept. It means facing everyone you've hurt while believing you are following your highest path. It means accepting you're just human, not special, not chosen, not more evolved. Most people cannot bear this level of humility, but for those who can, Jung offered a path. Genuine integration requires holding spiritual experiences without identifying with them, touching transpersonal material while knowing you're still human, growing while remaining aware of your ongoing unconsciousness. Real awakening looks nothing like what spiritual content promises. It doesn't make you feel special. It makes you more aware of how ordinary you are, how similar to everyone else, how capable of the same unconscious patterns Jung wrote. The truly awakened person is indistinguishable from anyone else in most contexts. They don't glow. They don't speak in elevated language. They don't need to tell you about their consciousness level. They're just present, humble, aware. They're still mostly unconscious. The inflated person, by contrast, needs you to know they're awakened. Their entire identity depends on it. If you've had powerful spiritual experiences and found yourself using them to feel superior, judge others, or explain why you're different, you've inflated, not awakened. If people who love you are telling you you've changed for the worse, become arrogant, impossible to connect with, they're seeing your inflation, not their unconsciousness. If you cannot receive this feedback without framing it as projection, you're deeply inflated. The path back requires destroying everything you've built around being awakened, admitting you were wrong, taking full responsibility for harm you caused while inflated, reintegrating your humanity. Most people won't do this. The cost is too high. But for those who can bear it, Jung promised something better than inflation: genuine integration. The capacity to hold powerful experiences without needing them to make you special, to touch transpersonal material while remaining profoundly human. This isn't glamorous. It won't make you feel chosen, but it's real. And it's the only way through the dangerous territory of spiritual awakening without becoming another narcissist with enlightenment vocabulary. Comment below which sign you recognized in yourself. Sign 3, discernment equals judgment. Sign 5, can't receive feedback. Sign 7, lost humor. Recognition without defense is the first step back from inflation. If this challenged something in you, if you felt defensive, angry, or dismissed it as not applying to you, that response itself deserves examination. The inflated person cannot see their inflation. Only the person integrating can. Subscribe for more of Jung's warnings about the spiritual path that no one wants to hear. The dangers, the inflation, the ways awakening can make you worse. Spiritual awakening is real, but most people who experience it become inflated rather than integrated. And inflation is narcissism wearing enlightenment as a mask.